In this video, I will review the muscle control formula and give an example using an isometric MTC action. To begin, let's review the muscle control formula. Step 1 is to identify the joint movement or position. Step 2 is to identify the effect of the external force on the joint movement or position. Step 3 is to identify the type of MTC action, either concentric, eccentric, or isometric. Step 4 is to identify the plane of movement and the axis of rotation. Step 5 is to identify on which side of the joint axis the MTCs are lengthening and on which side the MTCs are shortening. And we put it all together in Step 6 to identify which MTCs must be producing or controlling the movement or position. Step 1, we wish to identify the joint movement or position. In this example here, the arm is being held in this position for an extended period of time. Now, if we review what happens between A and B, nothing happens. The arm is being held. Now, instead of identifying a joint movement, we will be identifying a joint position. In this case, the joint is in an abducted position. And notice I use the word abducted, ED, right? Not abducting or abduction, because we don't know if we went from an adducted position to a less adducted position, or if we went from an adducted position or a neutral position to an abducted position. So in the case of identifying position, we usually use the suffix ed. For our second step, we want to identify the effect of the external force on the joint movement or position. We want to ask ourselves what movement would the external force produce if there were no active muscles. If we look at what happens between A and B, as I said, nothing is happening, but we still have the effect of gravity acting on our limb. In this case, gravity wants to create a counterclockwise torque. So if we identify the effect of the external force, we say the effect of the external force is adduction, or creating a torque from our perspective in a counterclockwise direction. In Step 3, we want to identify the type of MTC action, whether it's concentric, eccentric, or isometric. And we will use a decision diagram in order to help us come to the correct conclusion. First, we must identify the joint motion and the effect of the external force. Next, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the movement direction? And by movement direction, we have to relate that to the external force. So, one possibility would be that the joint movement and the effect of the external force are in opposite directions. Another possibility might be that the joint motion and the effect of the external force are in the same direction. If the joint motion and the effect of the external force are in opposite directions, we can conclude that we have a concentric MTC action. If the joint motion and the effect of the external force are in the same direction, then we have to determine the movement speed. And again, this is going to be in relation to the external force. So we have to ask ourselves another question. Is that joint motion occurring faster or slower than the effect of the external force alone? If the joint motion is faster than the effect of the external force alone, then we can conclude that we have a concentric MTC action. If, on the other hand, the joint motion is slower than the effect of the external force alone, then we can conclude that we have an eccentric MTC action. There are also cases where we will have no movement occurring, such as this one. In these cases, we can conclude that there is an isometric MTC action. Finally, we can have a joint motion that is across the effect of the external force. This means the joint motion and the effect of the external force are in different planes. In such cases, we can conclude that the MTC action is concentric. With that in mind, let's return back to this example. In this example, the arm is being held. But we know that there is an external force, gravity, which is going to want to rotate the arm downward. In order to have an effective torque which is 0, we are going to need to have a muscle torque which will be equal and opposite that direction. So in this case, we want to identify the MTC action. Since the position is being held, we can conclude that we have an isometric MTC action. Next, we want to identify the plane of movement and the axis of rotation. This is actually going to be unnecessary if it's a held position. For step 5, we want to identify on which side of the joint axis the MTCs are lengthening and on which side the MTCs are shortening. This will also be unnecessary if it's held, for reasons that will become apparent here in a second. So for step 6, we want to identify which MTCs must be producing or controlling the movement or position. The arm is being held from A to B. We know that gravity wants to create an adduction torque, so we are going to need an abduction torque in order to counteract that. So the general rule of thumb here for isometric actions is the MTCs that create a torque opposite of the external force are the MTCs that are going to be controlling that position. In this case, since gravity wants to create an abductor torque, the abductors, not shown here, will be controlling this position. So let's review what we went over in this video. First, in step 1, we have to identify the joint movement or position. In this case, we identified a joint position, which was an abducted, ED, position. Next, we have to identify the effect of the external force on the joint movement or position. And here we said gravity, being the external force, wants to abduct the joint. Third, we have to identify the type of MTC action, be it concentric, eccentric, or isometric. And since the joint position is being held, we conclude that this was an isometric MTC action. In step 4, we identify the plane of movement or the axis of rotation, and we said that really wasn't necessary when we talk about isometric MTC actions. Step 5, we identify on which side of the joint axis the MTCs are lengthening and on which side the MTCs are shortening. And again, we conclude that we really don't need to do this step because simply in step 6, when we identify which MTCs must be producing or controlling the movement or position, we are going to say it's the MTCs creating a torque about the joint, which is opposite that of the external force, which in this case would be the abductors acting isometrically.